I want to get them in.
Ah, excellent, excellent. Now, I apologise for the delay in getting underway. We have the screen, the projector, so you'll have the slides as well. And I think it'll make a lot of difference seeing the slides as well as just my presentation. So yeah, I'm very pleased to be here tonight to share with you some of the results of an ongoing research project on exactly this issue of democratization of discourse in Armenian society through the medium of print, which of course now is celebrating its 500th anniversary. The impact of which I think is already very well observable in the 17th century, and even more so, of course, when we get to the 18th century. From the inception, print operated through merchant capital. And here we see this wonderful painting. This is from an Armenian merchant. He's in Amsterdam. This is in the late 17th century. And the most important thing is his attribute. What does he have in his hand? A book. So immediately this connection between Armenian merchants, printing, books, reading, etc. is already very well established. Printing is associated not only then with the clergy, not only with the needs of the church, but also with secular pursuits and the involvement of the secular community, not only in financing, but also in other aspects of the process. So merchants, of course, needed high literacy and numeracy skills. And this, of course, equipped them to be the main readership for many of those new publications coming off those presses. And there is a direct correlation between the merchants' trade routes and the mobility of the presses which were established. So, of course, as you know, the whole thing begins in Venice in 1511, 1512. And why there? Of course, you have the larger Armenian community, but also, of course, it's still a major trading city between the Persian Empire and the Mediterranean. And of course, in the 16th century, it was the print capital of the world. Most books in the 16th century were published in Venice. And then when we move to the 17th century, the focus of Armenian trade moves. We're talking now about oceanic trade, and the center of the printing industry also moves, and it goes to Amsterdam. And Amsterdam is the print capital of the world in the 17th century. More French books are published in Amsterdam than in any other place in Paris. This is just one small example. Similarly, books were distributed by ship and caravan like other merchant commodities. One of the best routes was precisely then from Venice or from Amsterdam through the Mediterranean to Smyrna, and then on to Armenia, to Iran, and to the East Indies, etc. So I'd like to begin by outlining some of the issues and the approaches that we're going to be dealing with before we get on to the specifics. The period that we're going to be considering, so that's the 17th and 18th century, is a fascinating one. It's defined by Jerry Bentley and others as what we call the early modern era. So as such, it forms a link between the medieval and the modern. In terms of Armenian statehood, so we're talking about collective identity, it occupies the gap between the fall of the Seleucid Kingdom, 1375, and the establishment of the First Republic, 1918. It comes right in the middle of that period, and witnesses a range of stratagems to interpret and come to terms with the key transformations of the Armenian polity that occurred during this time. So Armenians are not fixed in the form that they were during the Seleucid period. They're continually changing, and print then seeks to try to come to terms with those changes to remain current. One of these features of the Armenian polity is diaspora. In the period that we're talking about, it was often regarded as being unitary. Diaspora is one. whatever different sort of diaspora it is, it's regarded as being one and the same. But we see now in more modern scholarship, such as that of Robin Cohen in Global Diasporas, an Introduction, that in fact it's much more complicated. And he argues for a whole range of subsets of diasporas, and I would argue that Armenians represent most of them. He only talks about Armenians with regard to number one, victim. Of course, we can think of Armenians as a victim diaspora, first and foremost in the genocide. But I would argue that we see different sorts of, these four diasporas are represented by Armenians. And we'll just talk about some examples of those. The classic victim diaspora, we see this is widespread in the Turco-Persian Wars in the 16th century, which resulted in the displacement of so many Armenian border communities. They're chased off their land as a result of the war. And we have several examples of diasporas of forced deportation, which of course is much more intrusive. The first example, of course, is New Julfa. Shah Abbas actually forcibly removed the population. Another good example of this period is Nor Nakhichevan. Catherine the Great removes the Armenians from the Crimea and places them near Rostov. A third type is the labor diaspora, and we'll have more to say about them as time goes on. They're basically economic migrants. They gravitate from the countryside to large cities, for example, Constantinople and Smyrna, in search of more lucrative employment. And the fourth, of course, then, is that of trade along networks integrated into the incipient world system of this period. In terms of profile, operation, self-reflection, these diverge from one another significantly in ways which were not always clearly perceived at that time, but which are very vital for our purpose in this discussion tonight. Naturally, as we already indicated, the situation on the Armenian Plateau did not remain static during these centuries. We see, for example, the demise of the local aristocracy. The final groups of princely families of Armenians gradually disappear. Increased Muslim hegemony. This leads to political, jurisprudential, economic, and other changes accompanied by a higher incidence of speaking Turkish and conversion to Islam. All this is happening in this period, 16th, 17th centuries. At the same time, we see another development impacting the Armenian communities in the Near East, coming primarily from France. The drive to advance French political and economic interests in the Near East. And they are in cahoots with the Catholic Church in what we call then the whole movement of the Counter-Reformation. This is a mission to restore the Catholicity of the Roman Church by securing the union of various Eastern churches, including the Armenian Church. So this is the movement that creates the Armenian Catholic Church, and it's primarily driven by France. This in turn, of course, provoked a robust response from the Armenian Church, the Apostolic Church, against these missionary activities. And so we see that printing afforded each one of these communities a voice to propagate their views within the Armenian community. So it didn't have to be someone had to go there and talk to you directly. You print a book, you publish it, you disperse it. All sorts of people then can have access to it in a much more meaningful way. So they have a voice to propagate their views, especially those contested perspectives on Armenian history, and brought their debate directly to the literate Armenian classes, enhancing the process then of dialogue and civil society. The spread of civil society then is connected with printing. We also note a symbiosis of three types of Armenian literature in this time frame. I think this also is very interesting. Though the interrelation between them is being realigned. So the first of these is oral. Oral tradition in the mass of the population on the plateau. And I'm going to be talking in particular about the Constantinople Yerke, songs of what I would call migration, songs of migration. And the second then is the transmission of works in manuscript form, primarily, of course, this is through the monastery. So oral, this is largely the illiterate population. Manuscript, this is the church through the monastery, so they're very, very distinct. And in Armenian, we captured exactly this directly in Madinakrutu, that material that was written and copied in a madyan, in a manuscript. The third is the one we're really focusing on, which is print. And print, of course, is the most uniform, most accurate, most flexible, and affordably priced than the second, and it's, of course, much more durable than the first, oral tradition. By the 19th century, just off our period, print is accepted as the most viable form of literary transmission, by which time it had established itself definitively as the vehicle not of these old elites of the aristocracy, the church hierarchy, but of the middle class, primarily, of course, of the merchants, and it has this modernist, secular worldview. And so in our period, 17th, 18th century, we're seeing gradually how we move towards that ultimate situation. So what I would like to do is to try to connect some of the dots between the medieval and the modern, in this early modern period, in the middle. And highlighting the role of printing in facilitating communication between the Armenian diaspora and the plateau, especially on the issue of defining communal identity and delineating the proper structures and institutions through which this communal identity should be represented. So what does it mean to be Armenian, and then how do Armenians express their collective identity? These are the main issues. Now, let's start with oral. Oral poetry is defined by its setting and function in a particular social ambiance. We talked about this widespread phenomenon of economic migration. They leave the land, they go to work in the big cities. This is Cohen's labor diaspora. This generated a set of songs, these Constantinople Yerke. These reaffirmed the strength of the bonds of the family, as well as expressing the forebodings of the kin with regard to the physical dangers and emotional anxieties that awaited the breadwinner, who had to leave them and go to the big city, separated from the warm, supportive family environment. Moreover, even in the city, when those breadwinners went there, they were displaced individuals with very little common affiliation through the church. That was the only way that they actually had direct contact with one another. These songs formed a sort of folk drama, and this would play itself out in the last days before the breadwinner left on the caravan. Now, clergy, this is the second tradition, we see that a number of clergy in the traditional mode, they continued to employ this genre of Constantinople Yerke, indicating their sense of loneliness and alienation when they went abroad. And a very good example of this is Simeon Yellowman, Simeon of Poland, and George Borudzian has done a wonderful work of translating this travelogue of Simeon of Poland for us. This is the very beginning of the 17th century. 1609, he goes on a long pilgrimage from Poland to Jerusalem, to Venice, to Compostela, and all sorts of other countries in between. And all the way along, he feels so alienated that he produces extempore Constantinople Yerke. So about, oh, how terrible it is to be here. I have no contact with anything. I am like one of the flock separated from its fellows. And so he goes on at length about this existential situation at various junctures. So the point is that he feels very much associated with this oral tradition. My point is, we cannot connect this with the merchant communities. They are not in that situation. And their expression through print is totally different. And what we see is that they're not at all a banducht. When they are in Venice and Amsterdam, they're quite at home there. And I'll give you proof to support that later on. So I think we're very wrong when we think of Grung and so on. We think, so they're in far Venice, far away Amsterdam. They're yearning. They're not. They're very much at home. So this, I think, is a major distinction. So, contrary then to the unregulated influx of these migrant workers, many Armenian trade diasporas, this is number 4 on the Cohen list, such as Lvov. This is one I want to highlight. We know a great deal about it. First of all, they were invited there. They weren't uninvited guests who suddenly turned up at the city gates. They were invited to go there by the local leaders in order to join cosmopolitan trade communities. There already were a whole series of Jews, Greeks and others who were in the city, and the Armenians joined them. And they were invited there in order to multiply the revenue from international trade. So they had a major advantage that they were asked to contribute to. And they usually had their own quarter in town. They were serviced by their own church, and here's the Armenian church in Lvov. Here's it from another angle. They had their own artisans to support them. And they themselves were a nucleus, a sort of microcosm of Armenians. So we have this community in a place like Lvov or Amsterdam or Venice, but the Armenians there come from all over the Armenian world. This also is very, very important. So you have them from places like Nakhichevan, Abulis, Van, Constantinople, etc. So you have a microcosm there of all of the range of the Armenian Plateau. And they required a degree of cooperation among themselves in those centers to survive in this very competitive environment. If they couldn't get it together, then of course they would fold. Moreover, while Armenians were identified as a religious minority in the Ottoman realm, so to be Armenian was to be a member of the Armenian Church. In Europe, so we're talking about Venice, Amsterdam, etc., Armenians were distinguished by their ethnic affinity. So to be Armenian was to be a part of the Armenian ethnic group, not religious, but secular. So this is a very, very important difference we will be coming back to several times. The Armenian merchants espouse basically a modernist project. And so we see that their self-reference differs enormously from the alienation of the banducht. We just talked about that. Physically from home and psychologically from his host environment. This was not their experience. The merchant communities also increasingly inhabited a new time-space continuum featuring a much higher degree of dynamism and change. In keeping with the model of Ernest Gellner in Nations and Nationalism, of nationalist ideology. And according to him, modern nationalist ideology across the board occurs in diaspora situations. Not in the center of the population, but in small groups of the population that are outside the main. And this is exactly what he indicates here. The rural Armenian peasants were drawn to seek work in those industrially developed areas. It's precisely there in diaspora that they later develop these nationalist tendencies. But in this case, in the case of the Armenians then, we see that this far exceeds the norms that Gellner envisages. Largely, of course, he's talking about the situation in Eastern Europe, which developed primarily in the 19th century. Here we see in the Armenian case, it begins in the 17th, develops further in the 18th, and of course then comes to a fuller fruition in the 19th. But it starts already in our period in the 17th century. Armenian merchants had a clean awareness of the global business network that they constituted. And the printer's colophons, the printer's notes to the reader at the end of the book, they reveal a powerful sense of Armenian solidarity as an ethnic group, very different from the localized loyalties to family, to town or village, traditionally expressed in those songs of migration. Very, very different situation. Indeed, it is significant that the printer Movsēs employs precisely the image of family as a segue to the Armenian nation, building on the semantic fluidity in the Armenian term us. So on the one hand, us gives us askain, national, but it also gives askagan, so other family members. So it's very slippery. It's not as distinct as in our English word nation, which has no connection directly then with any sense of family. But in the Armenian case, they're much closer. Moreover, we observe a particular rhetoric and a related lexicon employed in those printers' notes, which reinforces bonds of affiliation between readers on the basis of common origin and shared history. Several of these collective terms are found sometimes in earlier Armenian writing of the 10th to the 13th century, but they only now, through printing, enter into everyday language. Many of them derive from the root azl, denoting kinship, merazlia, belonging to our kin, hammaslia, relating to all the kin, and more particularly to a group of lexemes relating to the traditional progenitor. Hayk, Haygazn, Haygazun, Haygaznya, Hayk-agan. The primary source relating to Hayk is, of course, well, you tell me. We want to know about Hayk. We look first of all to where? Movsēs Xorenac'i, right. In whose oeuvre most of the lexemes we've just talked about, merazlia, hamaslia, haygagan, haygazlia, all those terms occur in Xorenac'i for the first time. Also intriguing is the presence of a now almost interchangeable synonym, aramazlia, aramya, again significantly less common in the classical period, which identify the community with the later hero Aram, who according to later Hebrew and Aramaic tradition was the source of their external designation as Armenians. So according to later tradition, this term Armenian, Armenios, etc., applied to Armenians, comes from the hero Aram. So it's very interesting that this group that is, who are Haygian, but who live in Venice and Amsterdam, among people that call them Armenian, adopt both. They are both Haygian and Aramian. And we see this in the materials that they themselves produce. So it suggests perhaps something of their hybrid status. They're Armenians in a predominantly non-Armenian environment. So they have both. Moreover, this printer, Tubir, Vipasanut'iwn, I talked about him just a little, arguably in part fulfills the role that Gellner assigns to Diaspora Intellectuals originally designated for a career in the church, whose interests become diverted in foreign urban milieu so that they become spokesmen for national ideology. So they go to receive a training in order to serve the church, but they become diverted and they end up not as priests, but as journalists, teachers, and professors. So to some degree, one of the first, and of course in the Armenian case we're not talking about one generation, we're talking about several generations in which this process takes place. Obviously, for you, I'm sure number one who would fit this category would be who? somebody who trained as a priest but became a journalist, teacher, professor. No, well, yeah, it's something along those lines, but I think there's a much better example. Well, but he never was trained as a priest, and he's really quite late. We expect this change to have occurred long before the beginning of the 20th century. Abovyan, Chachadur Abovyan was a deacon, went to Ararat, met with Professor Parrott, and then switched his whole tradition and became a teacher, writer, etc. So he is a primary example. But I would argue already in the 17th century, before him, this is prefigured by Movsēs Xorenac'i. He remained a Tubir. He was never ordained a priest. But this allowed him to expand enormously with regard to nationalist ideology. So, I'd like to quote something that Xorenac'i says to his Armenian readers. Ar hagaser intertsolos, in which he argues that at least as merchants, Armenians appear among Asian and Eastern nations as, I quote, glorious and resourceful, for they are accepted by all nations and loved by not a few. They continually travel over the whole world, treading every land underfoot. Armenia dear vodkidan gochelov. This is very, very striking. Seeing our Aramian nation everywhere, adorned with strategies, enriched with possessions, and embellished in its way of life, we count ourselves blessed on account of the bliss and the radiance of our nation. Unquote. So this is what he writes in one of his books. And of course, this question then of treading every land underfoot was said in the same year that this map was printed, 1695. And it was through the print shop in Amsterdam that we have the first Armenian world map. World map because it was needed by these merchants to go all over the world. So this is very, very important. Armenian merchants go all over the world. They are very, very self-confident. They have this enormous sense then of support one for another, and of this sense then of allegiance, affiliation, association. Now we're going to see that this is very, very different from the perspective on that diaspora that was held in the plateau. Significantly, this is from the print shop that published Xorenac'i's history in the same year. In this regard, it's worth noting the precise rubric with which the printers introduced the work as Askeranchun Dochmin Hapetian, Horinetzial I Movsēs Xorenac'i. So it's the genealogy of the Japhetian house and fundamental history of the first patriarchs, kings, princes, Naharars, and patriarchs of the Aramian nation, identifying the collective with its secular and religious elite. The approach illustrates a model of another writer on nationalism, Anthony Smith, with regard to the Eastern approach that highlights the ethnic group's shared history and cultural affinities. Next follows a compilation of a number of new histories based on Xorenac'i, supplemented by later sources. So one of the first of these is this Ashkamanchur Kakawaratsin Hayot, genealogy of the kings of Armenia. This is written by Minas Amdetsi, the Armenian Patriarch of Jerusalem, 1698, but published posthumously in Constantinople in 1735. Here we have another one. This is by a Jesuit priest, Jacques Villot. The history of the Catholicoi and the kings of the Armenians. This was published first in Venice in 1713. And this pattern we see continued then by Patriarch Hagop Naurian of Constantinople, in a much, much more impressive work of his, which you can see called here, Gansaran Zanuts Mat. We might interpret that Treasury of Information, which was published in Constantinople, 1758. Now, what's very interesting in his case is that he speaks about the Armenians in Book 4 of this work. In Book 3, he talks about a whole series of other nations. When he gets to Book 4 and the Armenians, he argues, and this is very, very striking, Armenians are currently ineligible to be classed as a nation because they don't have territory, they don't have statehood. And so, in order to include them in his project, so as not to be considered, he writes this himself, I don't want to be regarded as Hayrenadiats, so I have to include them, but I include them not along with the others, but only in terms of the past. So he starts with the Patriarch Hayk, he pursues Armenian history, Armenian kingship, Barur, and then on to the Arsacids, the Bagratunis, the Rupenids in Cilicia, highlighting the reader's achievements, especially their prowess and physical presence. To account for the Armenians' current situation, Naurian remains true, and obviously here he's very much an ecclesiastic, to the patristic and medieval view that the Armenians lost statehood as a result of divine retribution, as a result of their corporate sin. So this is obviously his perspective as an ecclesiastic. We're going to see that others later have a very different view of this situation. Now, we move on to another figure also talking about Armenian history. This is Ghazar Jahketsi. He is the Navirag, the representative of the Catholicos in Smyrna. And he argues against Naurian. Armenians do have a very important present history, and it's very important to write about that as well. Not only about the past history when they had a state. He does this then in his Drach Sangali, Desirable Paradise, published in Constantinople in 1735. Fundamentally we see that he traces Armenian history from the flood up to Cilicia in these heroic, larger-than-life proportions. And then, what happens after that? He pinpoints the center of the Armenian polity after that as the Catholicate. So the Armenian Catholicos becomes the center of the Armenians after the fall of Cilicia. This is very, very significant. And so, very typical of writers connected with Echmiadzin, he refers to the Armenians as the Hod, the flock. And automatically then, the Catholicos is the Hoviv, the shepherd. And it's very striking that Ghazar Jahketsi, 2 years after writing this, becomes elected Catholicos himself. So you can see this book is already preparing for the view that he was going to develop in Echmiadzin as well. Now, another very important work of this time, 1732, is this Daharan Hogri, also in Constantinople. And there we have this very unusual work, Vasen Askits Mero, On Our Nation. And there the author laments this current situation of Armenians when the once resplendent Armenian now serves as a slave. The scenario is further developed 5 years later, again by Ghazar Jahketsi, who's now Catholicos in Echmiadzin, in a poem, Voch Ivera Hayastan Ashrahi, Lament on the Land of Armenia, which is in his Yerkaran. And then he talks about the great exploits of Hayk the archer, the mighty Aram the giant, and their many descendants. And then he turns his gaze to more recent history, in which, I quote, our strong men have become weak, the rich and opulent are impoverished, the beautiful and tender are taken into captivity, unquote. Obviously in this, he's alluding to a series of deportations by Turks and Persians in the 1720s, 1730s. This is, of course, the time of David Bek and the Armenian insurrection. So, what's very important here is Xorenaci's interpretation. He offers a religious interpretation of the people's predicament, arguing that through this process of these deportations by the Turks and Persians, they are undergoing martyrdom. And as such, he bids them endure these persecutions as the Bible exhorts Christians. So, what do we conclude from this? It appears that Armenians have gradually undergone a transformation. They started out in the days of Hayk and Barur and the Rupelids as a civil polity. They have now ended up as a religious communion, not civil any longer. This theme is further expanded by Catholicos Simeon Yellowman in his Sposaran Hokivor, Spiritual Diversion of 1772. Now, this book is very significant. This is the first book to come off the press in Echmiadzin. And we may be wondering, well, how on earth did a press get to Echmiadzin in the first place? Presses are connected with major merchant entrepôt, major trade centers. Echmiadzin in Varshabat is completely out in the boondocks. It was established there because the Catholicos wanted it. And the Catholicos wanted it because he wanted a buoy pulpit to reach Armenians worldwide. Because he had something to say, and he felt that his word was not getting out properly. So he created his own press, and most of the early materials from that press are his. You can see for the first 10-15 years, only his works are published in Echmiadzin. So it's very, very clear that he wanted to communicate something to the Armenian diaspora. And in this work, he has a piece, Ahot Vochperkagant, Vasen Hasaragaskis, Yev Yegertsiatsis Hayots. Prayer of lament on the universal Armenian nation and its churches, in which he deplores, he implores divine mercy on the Hod Pokrik, the little flock. Very typical, as we said, of writers from Echmiadzin. Once again, and note the major contrast now with what we saw coming off the presses in Amsterdam. The Armenian diaspora is perceived as scattered over every land and suffering, entrusted into the hands of foreign lords and enemies, exactly the opposite of what the diaspora voice was saying. Nor, the Catholic continues, is there a divinely appointed leader for the Armenians like Moses, David, or Joshua in ancient Israel. The Armenian freeborn nobility are now under the dominion of others, while the populace at large is in servitude under the Muslim yoke and scarcely able to secure their livelihood. This approach underscores the status of communities on the Armenian Plateau under Islamic jurisprudence, particularly, of course, as we said already, interpreted in the Ottoman Empire. So Armenians there are not an ethnic, but a religious minority, on a par with the much more amorphous Rum Orthodox community. Rum Orthodox, so you have a whole range of ethnicities. Greeks, Albanians, Serbs, Bulgars, Arabs, all those ethnicities are under one group because they have the same faith. Armenians differ in faith, so they have a different designation, but alongside Armenians you also have Asuri. They are also in the Armenian millet. So it's not based on ethnic lines, but religious lines. This is very, very different. So as a consequence, the church becomes the only Armenian institution with legal standing. So it's very important to see it the right way round. People argue the church was the only institution that was so strong that it survived. No. The church was the only institution that was allowed to survive. The others were cut off. So the authority of the patriarch and his superior, the Catholicos, was extended from the purely spiritual sphere to the secular realm as well. In view of this, the primatial see gradually assumed a heightened profile, accruing titles such as Vehapar and Amanaim Hayos. Both of those were the prerogative of the Armenian king. There was no king, so gradually they accrued to the Catholicos, as well as developing a much more elaborate rite of consecration, as I'm sure you're well aware. The desire to further elevate Etchmiadzin as the epicenter around which the Armenian world should revolve clearly underlines most of Simeon Yellowman's published writings, and presumably underlies his deep desire to start a printing press. Also emblematic is a dialogue poem in which the Armenian nation appeals to our mother Etchmiadzin, and then receives a reply from Etchmiadzin. Moreover, in the second section of the Diasporas entitled Shnorhali ar Astvats, Vasen Hadug Pareramuchansik, Vork ar Askas Hayots. Thanks to God for his special benefactions toward the Armenian people. Etchmiadzin's divine Astvadzagert foundation and its role as a continually flowing fountain of spiritual gifts for Armenians, a source of envy for other nations, permeates this work. In contrast, whereas God had ordained kings for other peoples, the author argues that God himself is the king, lord, and prince of the Armenians. Moreover, when finally he does acknowledge that the secular Armenian authorities, he calls them princes and leaders of the people, Simeon does so to underscore their subordination to external ishchovats yev pernavorats, rulers and tyrants, i.e. the Persian and Ottoman officials, and their service to the church, whose pride and joy they should be. The corollary of this is presumably that they are included in the category of those under kingly rule who are pressed to display loyalty and obedience. So what we see from this is, of course, that Simeon has a quietist opinion. So basically, don't rock the boat with regard to Islamic rule. Not dissimilar from that reported by a village headman by the Indo-Armenian soldier adventurer Movsēs Xorenac'i on a journey across the Armenian Plateau in 1759. The villager informed him that the Armenians' king is Jesus Christ, and that God has placed them under Muslim suzerainty only to be released at the second coming. And when Emin pressed him, what is the source of this teaching? The headman said, the Holy Fathers of the Church. Championing an Islamic concept of Armenian corporate identity, that Armenian corporate identity is as the Armenian Church, as a non-territorial, confessional entity. Simeon nevertheless expresses entry into that communion practically as a fact of birth. Basically, you're born into the Armenian Church, rather than being a question of spiritual conviction. In applying to the print medium to contact his far-flung flock, he addresses them from a very traditional approach, in which his exhortation has the effect of a command, as if he was haranguing them during one of his sermons. This tactic, however, betrays his lack of awareness of the more egalitarian character of print, its inherent role in fostering critical judgment in the reader, rather than the collective instincts of a group gathered in church. In contrast, so we're now moving from the sacred to the secular, from the religious hierarchy to representatives of the Armenian merchant community, who now then have control of the press themselves. The very first of these is Shnorhali, the first significant lay Armenian historian of modern times, after, what's his name, Kumarjan. Yeremi Çelebi Kumarjan. He is the first, but much more significant is Shnorhali, who constructed his own press in the same year, 1772, in order to control the means of production, so as not to be closed down, as he almost was, by the Catholicos. Moreover, the cause of nationalism, which he championed, was facilitated in part by the Armenian community in India benefiting from exposure to press coverage of world events and discussions of political philosophy, particularly with regard to America. America in the 1760s to 1780s provided Armenian intellectuals with the first modern prototype for conducting a war of liberation. You want a typical case? Follow the Americans. And again, you want to create a nation state, you have the example of what was going on in the American colonies. And this is acknowledged in the preamble to this work, The Snare of Glory, which was published in Madras in the late 1780s. So very, very soon after these major developments were taking place right here in America. That volume emerged from a small dedicated cell composed of the wealthy pearl merchant Simeon Yellowman, who we saw, the intellectual Movsēs Xorenac'i, and the soldier Movsēs Xorenac'i. They advanced a radical modernist alternative to the clerical duality, ancient glory, contemporary servitude, through a more trenchant exposition of the process behind the collapse of Armenian statehood. How did it collapse? Corporate Armenian sin, or some other reason? So they suggest practical steps also by which the Armenian territory might be repossessed and a new state constructed on modern, more equitable principles. In this way, they represent a major milestone in the process that this historian of the press, Eisenstein, qualifies as the secularization or desacralization of the press. Moreover, the Madras project simultaneously incorporates elements of both the Eastern and Western models of nationalism that are proposed by Anthony Smith in the following way. So on the one hand, we have the Eastern model in this new pamphlet called Exhortation of 1772. This treats matters of shared history, patriotic affection for the beauty of the homeland, and motivation to prepare the long struggle for liberation. While the Western approach, focusing more on legal matters, occupies the attention in two subsequent works. The first of these then is the Target of 1783, and basically this contained contingency plans. So we said the long struggle to liberation. What would the Armenian community do until they had a liberated state? This book was to lay out the blueprint. Community administration until the establishment of a state. And then finally, when you had a state, the Vorokai Parats that we saw, the Snare of Glory, probably published in 1786-87, which lays out a blueprint for a constitution by which this liberated state should be governed. Now, this work of the press in Madras is also the most printed, because so far we've seen these works of Hagop Nalyan, Hovanes Golod, Lazar Chahketsi, Simeon Yellowman. They all, of course, are first and foremost monks, in their formation. They were trained in monasteries. They were very much associated then with manuscript culture. This is totally different. These merchants in Madras did not have manuscripts. All they had was books, but they used those books very, very well. So what did they have? 1695, what was produced? The first major historical publication of Movsēs Xorenac'i. They had that. It had got from Amsterdam to Madras. They had Razar-Jahkatsi's Dracht Tsangali, produced 1735 in Constantinople. They also had volume 2 of the dictionary of Movsēs rather than manuscript text. So this is a much more modern situation that we're in. Similarly, as Eisenstein indicates, printing facilitates a much more rapid development of disciplines rather than the mere replication of received standards through copying. So when you copy, you have one book in front of you and you copy that. You know everything that's in this one book. But in printing, you have all the sorts of printing books in front of you. You refer to several of them. You combine what they have to say, and as a result, science develops much, much faster. This we see in this work here of this group in Madras. Our authors also transformed the Ashkaratsuis, this world geography that was then attributed to Xorenac'i. That originally was published because it talked about the whole world, but they were interested in what it said about Armenia, Armenia's natural beauty, which was to promote patriotic affiliation on the part of those that read their book. Similarly, they produced this very significant variant. So, Peter Sebastici, 1751, produced a map like this of Armenia that was to go in his dictionary, basically just as an illustration. They, the Madras group, they commissioned a reprint of it with additions in 1778. So this is the second one. And you see that what's interesting here is, of course, that, look at this. That's a huge Greater Armenia. It has the original Greater Armenia plus all this area here. This is already Georgia. And then quite apart from that, this also is very, very significant. Let's look at it in a little more detail. You have all these standards, connected them with various troops, Armenian armies of the past. We already know who this is. Who is it? This is Hayk, with his bow as the attribute. And here, I think, in the back, we have Aram. Here, we have Tigran II, and this is Turdat III. So all these major figures of the Armenian past are there in order to heighten the impact of the map on readers. And also, of course, to develop this direct association with readers more directly, they gloss terms. This is produced in very simple classical Armenian, but they gloss some of those terms with the variants in the vernacular, Ashkarapar, so that they're able to understand better. These books also were distributed free of charge, so that there was no tax on knowledge of these books, no economic obstacle. And the other point was that they were so interested in developing their views and spreading them, a whole series were sent to King Erekle II of Georgia, and we have a letter from Shah Miriam to King Erekle suggesting that he should read these books and learn from them. And quite apart from that, 2,000 copies were made of a Russian translation, which was sent to the court in St. Petersburg, suggesting that they might learn from this also. They might also transform their game into a democratic republic. Well, it took a long time, but finally they did pay attention. Now, the historical aspect of the program unfolds in dialogue with their clerical antecedents that we've talked about already. So, first of all, the fundamental problem. Why was it that the Armenians lost their state in the past? They argue it's not sin, but psychological and institutional weakness is what they argue. So the first, disunity, lack of discipline, stubbornness. The second, lack of a proper school network, lack of a proper political structure. Primarily, they entrust supreme authority to one person on the criterion of lineage. You're the king's son, you're the king. Doesn't matter, are you very intelligent, are you very athletic, do you take initiative, or the very opposite. Genes determine who your leader is. So they're arguing, well, that's a very odd principle. Certainly not to be applied in the modern world. So in so doing, they provide an analysis of the historical process, which is lacking in all those works we talked about until now. They provide, as they say, a batsatrutyun, an explication of the precise issues undermining each one of those dynasties. Moreover, their study bears the precise imprint of the Enlightenment in their humanistic approach to history. History is not primarily the divine realm, and in their optimistic view of the possibility of discovering in history its internal laws. You can actually learn from the past. Their political philosophy follows Locke, Rousseau, and Voltaire in critiquing the arbitrary authoritarian state, seeking to replace it with an improved, more equitable alternative, with a national parliament elected by popular suffrage, whose prerogatives should be determined by a thoroughly reasoned constitution. At the outset, they sound the modernist watchword of awaking from slumber, and they are the very first to secularize the martyr Vartan Mamigonian. This is the first point at which he becomes a patriot, giving his life in defense of his native land, not primarily as one who dies for his faith. In this book, first, we see him as a patriot. And of course, this whole process of secularization of Vartan Mamigonian was to continue right through the 19th and on into the 20th century. Thus, nationalism demands the ultimate sacrifice that was once the monopoly of religion. Religion before, through Vartan Mamigonian, could ask you to give your life for your faith. Now they are saying the state, the country, can also demand the same because you are a patriot. Moreover, building on Locke's valorization of environment over heredity, his view that the mind is a tabula rasa that is formed through experience, they direct their message primarily to the youth as being more impressionable and open to consider these new perspectives, whereas the old generation is much too bound to the status quo to be open to this sort of change. Now, the final work that I'd like us very briefly to look at is also produced in Madras. This is by a priest, Tadios Xorenac'i, Voh Hayastanyats. Originally he was from Jufa. He printed this in 1791 at the press of Father Haruchun Shemavonyan, who of course was later the publisher of the Astaraj. So it's called De Dragvorgochi Voh Hayastanyats, pamphlet called Lament of the Armenians, but in fact it's only one part of this very complex work. Typical of his clerical mode, the writer indicates the impact of Stepanos Orbelian in the opening, especially in the depiction of the main figure as this Vortig Ruiz Airi, this widow who is bereft of her children. Now she implores them to return. However, the dialogue structure is very much like that of Simeon Yellowman that we talked about in the Sposalam Pokevo. But at the same time, we see a reconfiguration of the Armenians' orientation. In Sposalam Pokevo, the Armenians are directed towards Mile Echmiadzin. Now, in Xorenac'i, they are directed to Mile Hayastan. As Shahmirian had already mentioned in his Lord de Drag of 1772, highlighting the image that was destined to become a potent symbol of Armenian unity in the 19th century. And this, of course, is the original image, very different from the one that, of course, we see in Yerevan today. The three societies employed as models by Xorenac'i for imitation by Armenians are the English and the Spanish, with whom, of course, the Armenian merchants had many, many contacts by this time, to which he then adds Russia as a power that had advanced enormously as a result of the initiatives of Peter the Great. Yes. His inclusion, of course, is particularly significant in the line of what was going on at this point. Ongoing negotiations in the 1780s, 1790s with the Russian court concerning the Armenians' relocation to commercial centers. So we talked earlier on about the Armenians moving from the Crimea to Nakhichevan, near Rostov. And at the same time, we see a large number of Armenians now establishing themselves in the North Caucasus. Kizlyar, Mostok, Bidygorsk, etc., Vladikavkaz. And of course, within a very few years, those Armenians are going to join the Russian troops in moving south on Yemen. So all this was going on at the same time that he was writing. The final section of his work sums up the message through Aesop's fables. There he advocates the primacy of liberty, and that, of course, is very progressive for a priest of his time. The most important thing in human life is liberty. That comment also applies to his championship of agency. And we may paraphrase this: God helps the man who helps himself. Again, very unusual from the mouth of a priest. This divine-human synergy that is envisaged here moves significantly beyond this quiescence, don't rock the boat, of Simeon Yellowman and acts as a bridge to Rafi. Rafi's socialist interpretation of the original curse. You shall earn your bread by the sweat of your brow. Originally in Genesis, that's a curse when the early humanity transgresses. No longer will everything be provided by God, they'll have to do it themselves. Rafi turns this into a major advantage. This is a religious endorsement of human industry, hard work. And this is the blueprint for the future Armenian state that Rafi gives us in Khente, 1878. What do you mean? Oh, we're going too fast. Yeah. Meanwhile, the motivational role that Xorenac'i ascribes to Mother Armenia in his lament prefigures that of Mayra Rax in Rapayam Baganyan, in that famous dialogue poem in which the river challenges the reader to join in the sacred task of Armenia's liberation. Indeed, in general, the author prefigures the activities of the clerical intellectuals of the next generation, like Gabriel Baganyan, who impressed their message of society as a pedagogue, writer, printer, and journalist. In conclusion, we note the development of Armenian printing in Western Europe in several major commercial centers, heightening the rapport between the new technology and merchant capital, where it serves both the increasingly acculturate the Armenian middle class to values, concepts, and practices accepted in Europe, as well as to forge closer bonds of internal affiliation among themselves. At first, the books there circulate in the Armenian urban communities, and then they go to the Iranian Ottoman empires before print technology actually migrates there itself to Constantinople and, of course, to New Julfa, initiating a dialogue between the perspectives which may be initially classed as Eastern and Western, but certainly with the rise of Armenian printing in India, should become more readily identified as globalized. This is then the Madras perspective, versus regional, which is that of Etchmiadzin. While the former is typified by this faster process of secular and scientific development, gaining momentum from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, the latter, on the Armenian Plateau, emerges as more tradition-bound and reactionary, in keeping with a regional thought world that had not undergone that trajectory. So the plateau and the area around about it had not undergone a Renaissance, Reformation, etc., and therefore, of course, they were automatically much, much more traditional in their perspective than was true then of the Armenian diaspora. Printing similarly offered a new forum for the discussion of confessional differences. It was employed by the Roman Catholic propaganda, the papacy, the Armenian Uniate congregations, so the Armenian Catholic Church, the Mahitarists, and also, of course, representatives of the Armenian Apostolic Church, with varying skill and persuasiveness. Granted the inherent Christian distinction between ethnic, national, and the religious spheres, confessional fluidity did not have the profound implications of conversion to Islam. So whether you were Catholic or Apostolic did not matter so much as whether you, of course, became Muslim, which was widely viewed as a renunciation of Armenian society. Similarly, the overall secularizing trend increasingly dislocated religious adherence from civic participation, as reflected in the Madras draft constitution, which adopted the American separation of church and state, and pronounced all the citizens equal in most public spheres, regardless of their religious affiliation. Printing's encouragement of greater merchant and ethnic affiliation smoothly transitioned to issues of common origin and shared history, as we saw in the 17th century, and that in turn expanded to questions of territoriality and statehood and appeals to expectations of its renewal in the 18th century. Whereas at first these reflected the political quiescence and lack of agency of the clerical writers, this later gave way to a more humanist, future-oriented alternative seeking to educate the middle-class youth about the potential benefits of a democratic, republican Armenian state and the distinction between freedom, with its inner moral distinction associated with the Enlightenment, and formal independence. As stated at the outset, these views were developed in the second half of the 19th century, and we talked about Raphael Baganyan and Rafi, and were first inaugurated in the context of the First Republic in 1918. So it was a long journey ahead of them, but they had a major contribution to make in that whole process, particularly in the formation of the modern ideology of Armenian nationalism. And now, oh, I've done the wrong one.